Every nation has its political history, a winding road marked by predictable debates, steady leadership, and the gradual evolution of democracy. But then there are those moments that shatter the mold, the events so surprising, so utterly bizarre, that they redefine what Americans thought possible in their own government. These are the moments that made people drop their morning coffee, that sparked conversations at dinner tables for decades, that rewrote the textbooks, and left even the most seasoned political observers scratching their heads in disbelief. Today, we're counting down the top 10 craziest moments from U.S. political history. The events that prove truth is often stranger than fiction, and that the American political system has survived some truly wild rides. We'll take you through scandals that seemed impossible, elections that defied all logic, and moments where the country teetered on the edge of something unimaginable. By the end, you'll understand why these events earned their place on this list and why they still resonate in American politics today. Let's begin at number 10, a moment that shocked the nation and reveal just how vulnerable the American political system could be to infiltration and ideological extremism. In 1994, a man named John Allen Muhammad, along with his teenage accomplice Lee Boy Malvo, carried out a series of shootings that came to be known as the Beltway sniper attacks. What made this particular incident so politically charged was not just the terror it inspired across the Washington, D.C. area, but the way it became a rallying point for debates about gun control, homeland security, and the rise of domestic terrorism. Muhammad, a convert to Islam, had previously written letters to politicians and newspapers outlining his grievances with the government, and his actions forced America to confront the reality that terrorism could come from within its own borders, not just from foreign actors. The investigations that followed reveal disturbing details about how individuals had managed to hold an entire region hostage for weeks, shutting down schools, businesses, and fundamentally altering the daily lives of billions of people. The political fallout was immense, with then-Governor George W. Bush and other elected officials facing criticism for how they handled the crisis and what it revealed about gaps in law enforcement coordination. The Beltway sniper attacks changed how Americans thought about domestic security and planted seeds of fear that would grow even more potent in the years following September 11th. Moving up the list to number 9, we venture into one of the most bizarre episodes in American electoral history, a story so strange that it feels almost scripted by a Hollywood screenwriter. In 1969, a little-known candidate named John R. ran for governor of Louisiana against the famous incumbent Huey Long's brother, Earl Long. What made this race absolutely insane was that John R. was actually a pig, literally a pig named John R., who was entered into the gubernatorial race as a protest by political activists who were frustrated with the political establishment. The pig's name was an acronym standing for none of the above, and it was placed on the ballot to give voters a way to express their dissatisfaction with the candidates. When the votes were counted, John R., the pig, received over 41,000 votes, a staggering number that demonstrated just how disillusioned Louisiana voters were with their choices. Earl Long won the election, but the pig's surprising performance forced politicians across the country to recognize that voters were willing to make their voices heard in the most unconventional ways possible. This moment remains one of the most memorable protest votes in American history and serves as a reminder that democracy can sometimes be wonderfully absurd. Number 8 takes us into the halls of Congress during one of the most infamous moments of political violence in American history. In 1954, for Puerto Rican, nationalists opened fire on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, wounding 5 congressmen in what became known as the Capitol shooting of 1954. The shooters had flown from New York to Washington, entered the Capitol building with weapons hidden in their clothing, and as the session was underway, they stood up and began firing. The chaos that followed was absolute, with representatives diving under their desks and security personnel scrambling to respond. What made this moment particularly crazy from a political standpoint was the boldness of the attack itself, targeting the very heart of American democracy in an era when such acts were almost unthinkable. The nationalists were aiming to draw attention to Puerto Rico's desire for independence from the United States, and their attack succeeded in putting Puerto Rican independence back into the national conversation in a way that no political rally ever could. All 4 shooters were arrested, convicted, and eventually received clemency from President Jimmy Carter in 1979, but the incident permanently changed how the Capitol building was secured and how Congress approached its own safety. Now we arrive at number 7, an event that many Americans remember vividly even decades later, an episode that proved that American politics could produce moments of pure theatrical drama. In 1992, during a live presidential debate between George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Ross Perot, something extraordinary happened that no one had anticipated. Ross Perot, the independent candidate who was polling surprisingly high at the time, suddenly appeared to have a piece of paper stuck to his speaker, and for a brief moment his entire family was shown on camera with their hands raised in what appeared to be a Nazi salute. The moment was later explained as Perot's grandson pointing at something on the screen, but at the time, viewers watching at home were absolutely stunned. The image burned itself into the political consciousness of the nation and became one of those moments that gets referenced whenever someone talks about the weird aspects of American presidential debates. The debate itself was already historic for featuring a legitimate third-party candidate who was competitive in the polls. But this bizarre visual incident added a layer of strangeness that no one could have predicted. Some political analysts believe this moment may have contributed to Perot's eventual drop from the race shortly thereafter, though the official reason he gave was concerns about his daughter's safety. Number 6 on our list takes us back to the early days of the Republic, when the young American nation was still figuring out its own identity and occasionally making decisions that seemed almost incomprehensible by modern standards. In 1804, former Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson's vice president, Aaron Burr, killed former Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton in a duel that shocked the nation and changed the course of American political history. Now, duels were not uncommon in this era, and political rivalries often turned violent. But what made this particular shooting so absolutely crazy was the stature of the 2 men involved. Hamilton was one of the founding fathers, the author of the Federalist Papers, and a figure of immense intellectual influence on the American system of government. Burr was the Vice President of the United States, a man who had once been considered a potential president himself. When Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel in Weehawken, New Jersey, and then shot him, the nation reacted with horror and disbelief. Hamilton's death effectively destroyed Burr's political career, ending any chance he had of ever becoming president, and it cast a shadow over the entire concept of political violence in America. The aftermath led to changes in how duels were perceived and eventually contributed to their decline as acceptable behavior among gentlemen. We're getting into the most dramatic territory now, so let's move to number 5. An event that represents perhaps the most egregious abuse of power in modern American political history. In 1972, operatives connected to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C., setting off a chain of events that would eventually lead to the first and only resignation of an American president. What made Watergate so absolutely insane was not just the break-in itself, which was audacious enough, but the systematic cover-up that followed, involving the CIA, the FBI, and the highest levels of the Nixon administration. The story unraveled slowly through the investigations of journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and as more details emerged, the American public became increasingly horrified by the scope of criminal activity in the White House. The famous recordings that Nixon had made of his own conversations in the Oval Office became known as the smoking gun that proved his involvement in the cover-up and ultimately forced his hand. On August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon became the first U.S. president to resign from office, delivering a tearful resignation speech that shocked the world. The Watergate scandal fundamentally changed how Americans viewed their government and led to significant reforms in campaign finance and executive power. Number 4 takes us into an even darker chapter, one that many Americans still find difficult to discuss openly. In 1919, the United States experienced one of the most massive waves of racist violence in its history, a period known as the Red Summer, during which white mobs attacked black communities across the country. The violence was particularly intense in Chicago, where a race riot in late July and early August of 1919 resulted in the deaths of 38 people and the destruction of hundreds of homes, mostly in black neighborhoods. But what made this particular moment politically crazy was how the violence was actually encouraged and facilitated by political leaders and media outlets that spewed racist propaganda designed to stoke fear and resentment. The riot in Chicago was just one of many similar outbreaks in cities like Washington, D.C., Knoxville, and Elaine, Arkansas, where black citizens were murdered by mobs simply for demanding basic rights and fair treatment. The political implications were enormous, as these riots exposed the deep-seated racism that permeated American society and forced a reckoning with the reality that the promise of equality in the Constitution meant very little in practice. It would take decades of struggle and activism before the civil rights movement would begin to meaningfully address the violence and oppression that had defined the Red Summer. We're now approaching the top 3, so let's turn to number 3, an event that perfectly illustrates how American politics can produce moments of such pure absurdity that they defy all rational explanation. In 1980, a man named Ronald McDonald attempted to run for President of the United States as a candidate for what was called the Rent is Too High Party. His campaign was entirely serious, and he managed to get on the ballot in several states, ultimately receiving over 40,000 votes in the general election. But what made this candidacy so remarkably crazy was not just the name, which was obviously designed to draw attention, but the fact that Ronald McDonald was a clown by profession, a literal circus performer who had decided that the best way to address the nation's problems was to run for the highest office in the land. His campaign platform included suggestions that the government should provide free rent to all Americans, a policy that was obviously unrealistic, but captured the public's imagination nonetheless. While Ronald McDonald did not win any electoral votes, his candidacy demonstrated that the American political system is theoretically open to anyone, no matter how unconventional their background or qualifications might be. Number 2 is an event that still sparks controversy and debate more than a century after it occurred, a moment that exposed the deepest flaws in American democracy and forced the nation to confront the reality of its original sin. In 1876, the presidential election between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden resulted in one of the most contested and controversial elections in American history. The results were so close and so disputed that Congress created a special electoral commission to resolve the matter, and negotiations behind the scenes eventually led to the infamous Compromise of 1877. In exchange for Hayes being declared the winner, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction and abandoning black Americans to the mercy of white supremacist governments that would soon implement Jim Crow laws. The deal was done in secret, with no public oversight, and it represented a betrayal of everything the Civil War had been fought to achieve. What made this moment so crazy was not just the backroom dealing itself, which was already scandalous enough, but the fact that it established a precedent for resolving electoral disputes through political bargaining rather than through the democratic process. The consequences of this compromise would reverberate through American politics for more than a century, shaping everything from civil rights to voting rights to the fundamental question of whether all Americans truly had equal access to the ballot box. And finally, we arrive at number 1, the craziest moment in U.S. political history, an event so shocking, so unprecedented, and so consequential that it towers above everything else on this list. In 1865, just days after the end of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and Confederate sympathizer who had plotted for months to kill the president. The assassination itself was dramatic enough, with Booth leaping from the presidential box to the stage and escaping into the night. But what followed was an even greater political earthquake. Secretary of State William H. Seward was also attacked in his home on the same night, nearly killed, and the coordinated nature of the violence suggested a broader conspiracy to destroy the entire Union government. The manhunt that followed was intense, with federal troops hunting Booth across the Maryland countryside until he was finally cornered and shot in a barn. The death of Lincoln threw the nation into mourning and created an enormous power vacuum at the exact moment when the country needed strong leadership to rebuild and reconcile. Vice President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, proved to be deeply problematic, and his lenient approach to the defeated South led to the implementation of the black codes that would keep black Americans in a state of near slavery for generations. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln changed everything about American politics, and its reverberations are still felt today, more than 150 years later. So there you have it, the top 10 craziest moments in U.S. political history, events that prove the American political system has never been boring, predictable, or free from controversy. From assassins in the night to protest candidates running as pigs. From duels between founding fathers to secret compromises that abandoned an entire population, these moments have shaped the nation in ways that are still being felt today. They serve as reminders that democracy is messy, that power attracts both the best and the worst of humanity, and that the United States has always been a work in progress. What makes these moments so fascinating is not just their dramatic content, but what they reveal about the American character, about the willingness of people to fight for what they believe in, even when that fight involves violence, deception, or pure madness. As you reflect on these events, consider how different the country might look today if any one of these moments had unfolded differently, and remember that history is never as fixed or as certain as it might seem. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the wildest moments in American political history, and we'll see you next time for more stories that prove truth is stranger than fiction.